Greater Lebanon, 1920. The birth of a Na. It's September 1920, exactly 100 years ago, and the map of the Middle East is about to be redrawn forever. In just one day, with the stroke of a pen, an entire nation will come into existence. But here's the thing that'll absolutely blow your mind. This was not some peaceful negotiation over tea and biscuits. This was the result of famine, war, political backstabbing, and deals made in smoke-filled rooms thousands of miles away. What happened in September 1920 would shape the Middle East for the next century. And trust me, by the time we're done here, you'll understand why Lebanon, that tiny country you might only know from the news, holds the key to understanding the entire modern Middle East. So settle in, because we're about to dive into one of history's most fascinating stories of how nations are really born. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered how countries actually come to exist? I mean, really exist. Not just as lines on a map, but as places where real people live, breathe, and call home. Well, the story I am about to tell you is exactly that. The birth of a nation that nobody saw coming, created by people who'd never even set foot there. The year was 1920, and the world was still reeling from the Great War. The Ottoman Empire, that massive power that had controlled the Middle East for centuries, was crumbling faster than a stale biscuit. And into this chaos stepped the French, the British, and a whole cast of characters with their own agendas, their own dreams, and their own ideas about how to carve up the world. But here's where it gets really interesting. The French weren't just wandering into Lebanon randomly. They'd been there before, building relationships, constructing railways, introducing new farming techniques. They'd basically been laying the groundwork for decades. It's like they'd been playing the world's longest game of chess, and now it was time for checkmate. The territory we're talking about, what would become Greater Lebanon, had belonged to the Ottoman Empire for centuries. By 1914, it was chopped up into several different administrative regions, with the biggest one being Mount Lebanon. Now, Mount Lebanon wasn't just any old province. It had been created back in 1861 because the European powers had basically twisted the Ottomans, armed to give the Christian majority their own autonomous space. And here, as something that'll surprise you, French influence was already massive in Lebanon long before 1920. They weren't just there for political reasons. The French had introduced silkworm farming, which might sound boring, but it was actually revolutionary for the local economy. They built the port of Beirut and constructed the Beirut-Damascus Railway. These weren't just infrastructure projects. They were lifelines that connected Lebanon to the wider world. But Lebanon was never simple, and it certainly wasn't simple in 1920. The population was this fascinating mix of different groups who, frankly, didn't always get along. The majority in Mount Lebanon were Arabic-speaking Christians belonging to the Maronite church. Now, the Maronites had these deep historic and religious connections to France. They'd been tight for centuries. So when the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918, the Maronites thought, right, this is our moment. Time to lobby for independence, but independence with France holding our hand. Then you had the Druze community. The Druze practiced this unique religion based on Islam, but they weren't considered Orthodox Muslims by anyone's standards. Some of them had actively fought against the Ottomans during the war, and now they were hoping for a British mandate instead of French control. To the northeast and south of Mount Lebanon, you had large communities of Orthodox Christians and Muslims, both Sunni and Shia. And here's where it gets politically messy. Many of these communities supported Pan-Arabism, the idea that all Arabs should be united into one massive, independent state. You can imagine how well that went down with the Maronites, who wanted their own little Christian nation. Nearly all the Muslims, and quite a few Orthodox Christians living in areas next to Mount Lebanon, wanted British rule instead of French rule. So you've got this incredible patchwork of different communities with completely different political goals, all living cheek by jowl in this tiny area, all trying to figure out what the hell was going to happen to them next. And all of this political maneuvering was happening against the backdrop of an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. The Great War had been an unmitigated disaster for the people of Mount Lebanon and the surrounding areas. When I say disaster, I mean biblical proportions of suffering. The region had been cut off from French support during the war and had suffered brutal political repression under the local Ottoman commander-in-chief, Jamal Pasha. This bloke was absolutely ruthless. He had dozens of suspected opponents killed and thousands more exiled, especially Arab nationalists. The Ottomans also imposed conscription, which people still remember decades later by its Ottoman name, Seferberlik, or mobilization. Just hearing that word was enough to make people's blood run cold. But the killing and exile were just the beginning. There was a serious shortage of coal, which meant they had to cut down the forests for fuel. This led to massive deforestation that continued even after Allied troops arrived, because the British started shipping lumber to Egypt. The silk production that had been one of the main economic activities before the war stopped completely. Under the strain of war, the Ottoman administration basically collapsed and couldn't govern effectively. But here is the truly heartbreaking part. The worst disaster to hit what would become Greater Lebanon during the war was starvation. There was widespread hunger throughout the entire Ottoman Empire, made infinitely worse by the Allied naval blockade. But the Ottomans themselves also cut off supplies to Lebanon. This led to a famine so terrible it killed about 1/3 of the population. 1/3. Can you even imagine that? French naval medic Dr. Pierre witnessed this horror firsthand when Allied forces arrived in 1918. His description will haunt you. When our first detachments arrived, the scene in the streets of Beirut was horrible. One could believe that he de-landed in a medieval town at the time of the great famines of history. Passers-by were covered in rags, emaciated, with earthy complexions, their eyes shining with fever in the depths of their orbits, dragging themselves miserably, stretching out their hands. Corpses lay everywhere. Carts loaded up with corpses picked up from all corners, dumping up to 100 a day into mass graves. Just think about that for a moment. 100 corpses a day being dumped into mass graves. This was an ancient history. This was 1918, the same year the war ended in Europe, with celebrations and parades. To feed the surviving population, the French, British, local churches, Muslim councils, and the new Arab provisional government in Damascus all worked frantically to bring in and distribute supplies. French missionaries who had been active in Lebanon before the war and had then been conscripted into the French army also helped with relief efforts. By the end of 1918, the Allied blockade was lifted and the famine was finally brought under control. The French immediately began efforts to reforest the area and restore agriculture. But the damage was done. Throughout 1919, conditions in future Lebanon remained absolutely dire. You also had hundreds of thousands of Armenian refugees spread throughout the Middle East after the wartime genocide. French and British authorities were trying to relocate them, and one of the main refugee camps was in Beirut. From there, refugees could travel to new homes abroad or attempt to return to Anatolia. Though God knows why anyone would want to go back to that hellscape. The war had also left about 20,000 orphans in Lebanese lands, half of whom were Armenian. A major relief effort was organized to place them into orphanages so they could be cared for properly. So picture this. Lebanese provinces had been absolutely decimated by war and famine when the Allied forces arrived. But humanitarian relief wasn't the only thing on the minds of the French and British. Both had major political aspirations for the region as well. Now, here's where the story gets really juicy. Allied war aims in the Middle East had been worked out back in 1916 with something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. By 1918, the Russians were out of the picture. They had their own revolution to deal with, but British interests in Palestine and Iraq and French hopes for Syria and the Levant remained very much intact. The thing was, the war had actually weakened France's position. Before 1914, they'd built up all this soft power influence in Lebanon, the cultural connections, the economic ties, the religious links. But the war had disrupted all of that. Meanwhile, British troops had done most of the actual fighting against the Ottomans, so they were the ones who'd occupied most of the areas as the Ottomans withdrew. French troops did arrive in late 1918, but initially they remained under British command. Several different zones of occupation were established. The French predominated in the Lebanese provinces, and on the Syrian coast, the Hashemite Arab forces controlled Damascus and Aleppo provinces, and the British controlled the areas further east. French diplomat Francois Sykes-Picot was put in charge of overseeing the French return, though he was later replaced by General Henry Gouraud in 1919. Now, in theory, these occupation zones were meant to be temporary. French instructions to their local commanders made this crystal clear. The chief administrators and the military governors must be fully aware that the military occupation is temporary and provisional and cannot in any way prejudice the final settlement which will be established at the peace conference. But anyone with half a brain could see tensions brewing. British General Edmund Allenby even suggested that French control should be limited just to the coast. The French weren't having any of that nonsense. France wasted absolutely no time in making its intentions clear. In December 1980, French Foreign Minister Stéphane Pichon laid it all out. We have incontestable rights to safeguard in the empire of the Turks. We have rights in Syria, in Lebanon, in Cilicia, in Palestine. They are based on historical titles, agreements, and contracts. They are also based on the aspirations and wishes of the populations who have long been our clients. We will do our utmost to assert them. But we consider that these agreements established with England continue to bind England and us, and that the rights which have been recognized to us and of which we will request the extension to the conference are now acquired rights. Pichon's speech made French intentions absolutely crystal clear, but it also set off riots in Damascus because there was another major player in this game. The Arab nationalist movement, when the British had pushed out the Ottomans in 1917 and 1918. They'd been helped by an Arab force under the command of the Hashemite family. Faisal had led Arab troops in the field as they entered Syria, and now he hoped to establish himself as king of an Arab kingdom, stretching from the Mediterranean all the way to Mesopotamia. Now, Faisal was actually willing to compromise when push came to shove, but the Syrian National Congress in Damascus took a much firmer line. Their vision of Greater Syria included the Lebanese provinces in a future Arab kingdom. Faisal even appointed General Shukri Ayoubei as governor of Beirut, even though the French had already appointed their own governor. Talk about awkward. Faisal also visited the Lebanese district of Baalbek to rally the locals and issued this memorandum in January 1919. The aim of the Arab nationalist movement is to unite the Arabs eventually into one nation. These conflicting claims did not bode well for relations with a French government that was absolutely determined to have a strong presence in the region. So Juve got the Lebanese provinces caught right in the middle of these massive political changes coming to the former Ottoman Arab provinces under Allied occupation in 1919 and 1920. And even though the Great War was officially over, the violence certainly wasn't. Future Lebanon was surrounded by violent outbreaks on nearly all sides as different groups tried to fill the power vacuum left by the collapse of Ottoman power. Arab, Turkish, and Kurdish revolts against the French presence broke out in the Ansariya Mountains and around Aleppo, then spread south to nearby Antioch and Jebel Qusir in early 1919. The French managed to put these down, but in July it was the Alawites' turn to rebel in Hama. The French sent troops to deal with this, but it led to a diplomatic incident with the British, who still had troops in the region, and nearly fired on a French officer who was traveling with a French-friendly tribal leader. In nearby Cilicia, Armenian-Turkish clashes led to French and Armenian troops becoming embroiled in a full-scale war with Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal. The fighting continued until costly battles at Marashraf and Antava forced an armistice between the French and Turks in May 1920. Down south, there were also clashes between Jews and Arabs in British-occupied Palestine. With so much fighting and chaos everywhere, it's no surprise that there was disorder within future Lebanon as well. Various groups of bandits raided the districts of Tyre and Marjayoun. In these same towns, local Christians, Druze, and Shia Muslims clashed with each other. This resulted in French attacks against the Shiite stronghold of Bin Jibail, and hundreds of Christian refugees fleeing to British-occupied Palestine. Bedouin tribes were also active, raiding several districts, including Baalbek. The Bedouins also raided French and Anzac outposts, which caused the British to attack the tribes with aircraft and send a formal protest to fight. Even though Faisal himself was trying unsuccessfully to stop the Bedouin attacks. Not to be left out, Australian troops also rioted and killed 40 civilians as revenge for the murder of an Australian soldier. So you had chaos everywhere you looked. It was against this background of Anglo-French tensions, Arab nationalist ambitions, and ongoing violence that the future of the Lebanese provinces was to be decided. The stage was set for a complicated series of negotiations and eventually a war to decide the fate of Lebanon and the rest of the Middle East. The whole thing kicked off with the 1919 peace conference in Paris. Almost as soon as Allied forces had replaced the Ottomans, the jockeying for political advantage had begun. On December 17, 1980, we re-talking. Barely a month after the armistice, the Administrative Council of Mount Lebanon was already forming its demands for a Lebanese state. They felt that the Ottomans had broken the 1861 agreement for an autonomous Lebanon and resolved to send a mission to Paris. A delegation will represent the autonomous government of Mount Lebanon at the peace conference to transmit the following claims: extension of the territory of present-day Lebanon to its historical and geographical limits, and the support of the French government for the fulfillment of the aforementioned wishes. The Mount Lebanon delegation, led by Daoud Amou, pressed their case for territorial additions and independence from their neighbors under French protection. The areas they wished to add to Mount Lebanon included the cities of Beirut, Tripoli, Sidon, and the districts of Akkar, Baalbek, Hasbaya, Rashaya, and Mar. The French, unsurprisingly, supported these claims as the natural and historic borders of the country to be, but the Syrian nationalists also had their own delegation in Paris and were lobbying hard for an independent Greater Syria, though they disagreed about who would rule it. Syrian National Committee Chair Shukri Ghanim argued that historic Syria ought to include both the Lebanese provinces and Palestine, and rejected the Sykes-Picot Agreement outright. This proposal, however, was not supported by the British or French, who were still hashing out the implementation of Sykes-Picot amongst themselves. Fazl was in Paris as well, trying to convince the Allies to accept a unified Arab state from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia under his rule. But he eventually abandoned this position and argued instead for a greater Syrian kingdom. Lloyd George did show some sympathy for this idea at first, but the French were absolutely opposed, since they were determined to gain control over Syria as foreseen in response to the Syrian claims. Another Lebanese delegation, this time under Maronite Patriarch Ilyas Hoxha, went to Paris in August 1919 to press the Lebanese claims. To make his case, he used a military survey map made by the French army in the 1860s, which became the focus of French ideas about what a future Lebanon would look like. It's a perfect example of the power of maps in history. Sometimes a piece of paper can literally reshape the world. Around the same time, the Supreme Council was discussing the Middle East in general, and the British and French finally came to an agreement about what to do with Syria. British forces would withdraw to the east of the Sykes-Picot line, dividing Mesopotamia and Syria. Their place would be taken by the French in the west and Fazl's troops in the occupation zone in Syria. The French also accepted that they would have to come to a border agreement with Levant. In October and November 1919, the French heard the claims of both the Lebanese and Fazl. After these discussions, Clemenceau and Fazl reached an agreement that Lebanon would be separate from Syria. The disputed Baalbek region would become a neutral zone, and Fazl would be permitted to become king of Syria in return for accepting French influence over his new kingdom. Fazl would get his coveted kingdom, and as French bureaucrat Eugène Jung put it, France would safeguard our moral and political preponderance in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. 1920 would bring a resolution to the Lebanese question, but only after more political wrangling and another war. In January, Alexander Millerand replaced Clemenceau as Prime Minister of France. Millerand was a colonialist who put more emphasis on French ambitions in the Middle East, since the Americans had left the peace conference at the end of 1919. The way was now open for Britain and France to impose their will. In February 1920, Britain and France decided on the future frontiers of much of the Ottoman Empire, including a preliminary agreement on Lebanon's borders. Patriarch Hoxha sent a third delegation to Paris to ensure that the Lebanese claims for expanded borders, known as Greater Lebanon, would be implemented by the French. This last Lebanese delegation included not only Christians, but Druze and Shiite representatives as well. This occurred just as the French and British were coming to a final agreement about future Lebanon as southern frontiers, which had been a major bone of contention. The result was that a small strip of territory around Lake Hula, claimed by France and the Lebanese delegations, ended up in British Palestine, with the border established along the so-called Douve line in accordance with the claims of the Zionist movement. By mid-1920, the British and French had managed to come to a broad agreement on where the borders of their respective League of Nations mandates in the Middle East would lie. This certainly did not correspond to the aspirations of either Faisal or the Syrian National Congress, which declared him King of Syria in March 1920. This surprised and absolutely enraged the French, since it went against their agreement with Faisal, and the proposed borders of Syria were to include the Lebanese provinces. The French were not amused. Despite Faisal's offer of a generous compromise, French troops invaded Syria from their Lebanese bases in July 1920. Faisal's overmatched Arab army was defeated at the Battle of Massaloun, and he fled the country. This meant that the last barrier to France implementing its plans in Syria and Lebanon had been removed. There was some discussion about how to divide up the mandated territory. General Gouraud favored a federation of 4 Syrian states, which would be joined in a loose confederation with Lebanon. Milrant, on the other hand, argued for a separate Lebanon and for dividing Syria into 8 smaller statelets. Both agreed that the Ottoman province of Mount Lebanon should be expanded according to the claims of the Lebanese delegations and that old French military map of 1862. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Syria was divided into 4 states: Jabal al-Drus, Damascus, Ali, and the Alawite state, a solution that was deeply unpopular with most locals. Mount Lebanon was joined with the surrounding areas, including Tripoli, Baalbek, Sid, and Tyre. On September 1st, 1920, the state of Greater Lebanon, Grand Lebanon, was announced. This was the forerunner of today's Lebanese Republic, but it was not fully independent since France would continue to oversee the country under the League of Nations mandate. The creation of Greater Lebanon was controversial from the very start, as the French newspaper Le Temps admitted at the time. No doubt the creation of Greater Lebanon will not be unfavorable to the Muslims, whose political influence will grow. A Lebanese policy is nevertheless a policy of protecting Christians in the Orient. In Greater Syria, which we now guide, one must not forget that Muslims outnumber Christians by 3 to 1, and it would be disastrous if we continue to excite the Muslims against us in the future. For many Christian Lebanese, it was a long-awaited nation-building project that had finally come true. For Arab nationalists, it was one more political step away from a united Pan-Arab state. For both Christian and Muslim Lebanese, building a new state surrounded by an unstable French Syria and British Palestine would prove to be an incredibly difficult task. Nonetheless, the proclamation of the State of Greater Lebanon in September 1920 is considered a major step on the road to Lebanese statehood and eventual independence in the 1940s. Efforts to restore the economy, replenish the forests, and grant equal rights to all groups began immediately. But the future of this new state was deeply uncertain. As one historian would later note, the new Grand Lebanon now encompassed areas that gave Maronite Lebanon a large Muslim population, providing the basis for the intercommunal conflicts that would repeatedly ravage the country in the future. And there you have it, the birth of Greater Lebanon in September 1920. Exactly 100 years ago, a nation born from the ashes of empire, shaped by famine and war, created by foreign powers who thought they knew best, and populated by communities who couldn't agree on what they wanted their future to look like. It's a story that shows how the modern Middle East was really created, not through careful planning or democratic consultation, but through backroom deals, military conquest, and the competing ambitions of great powers. The consequences of those decisions made in Paris conference rooms and Lebanese mountainsides are still playing out today. What happened in September 1920 wasn't just the creation of Lebanon, it was a template for how the entire post-Ottoman Middle East would be carved up. The same mixture of imperial ambition, local aspirations, and international power politics would shape Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine as well. And here's the thing that really gets me. None of this was inevitable. Different decisions could have been made. Different borders could have been drawn. Different communities could have been brought together or kept apart. The history of the entire 20th century in the Middle East might have been completely different, but this is the history we got. This is the story of how a small corner of the Ottoman Empire became the Republic of Lebanon. It's a story of how maps become reality, how foreign powers shape local destinies, and how the decisions of 1920 echo through to 2020 and beyond. So the next time you hear about Lebanon in the news, whether it's about politics, economics, or regional tensions, remember September 1920? Remember the French officials drawing lines on maps, the Maronite delegations in Paris hotel rooms, the starving refugees in Beirut's streets, and the Arab nationalist dreams that were crushed at because understanding how Lebanon came to be helps us understand not just Lebanon, but the entire modern Middle East. And in a world where borders still matter, where communities still struggle with identity and belonging, where great powers still try to reshape distant regions according to their own interests. Well, the story of Greater Lebanon in 1920 is more relevant than ever. That's the power of history, isn't it? It doesn't just tell us what happened, it helps us understand what's still happening. And sometimes, if we're lucky, it might even help us figure out what should happen next. Right then. If you've made it this far, you're clearly as fascinated by this stuff as I am. And I've got to tell you, there's so much more to explore. The story of Greater Lebanon is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The reshaping of the entire Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. We could spend hours talking about what happened next, how Lebanon navigated the French Mandate period, how it achieved independence, how it became the cosmopolitan hub of the Middle East in the 1950s and 60s, and how it descended into civil war in the 1970s and 80s. We could explore the parallel stories in Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. We could examine how the decisions made in those Paris conference rooms in 1920 are still shaping Middle Eastern politics today. History isn't just about dates and names and treaties. It is about understanding how we got to where we are today. And, frankly, you can't understand the modern Middle East without understanding what happened in September 1920. So if this story has grabbed you, if it has made you think differently about Lebanon or the Middle East or how nations are really born, then I've done my job. Because history matters. It shapes us. It informs us. And sometimes, just sometimes, it might even help us make better decisions about the future. The story of Greater Lebanon in 1920 shows us that borders aren't permanent, that communities can be brought together or torn apart by the stroke of a pen, and that the consequences of political decisions can echo through generations. It is a reminder that history is made by real people making real choices, and that those choices have real consequences for millions of other real people. And that, my friends, is why we study history. Not just to know what happened, but to understand why it happened, how it happened, and what it means for all of us today. So there you have it. The extraordinary, tragic, fascinating, and ultimately consequential story of how Greater Lebanon came to be in September 1920. 100 years ago, the map of the Middle East was redrawn forever, and we're still living with the results today. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey into the past. History can be complex, messy, and sometimes heartbreaking, but it's never boring. And understanding it is one of the keys to understanding our world today. If you found this story as compelling as I do, make sure you don't miss out on more incredible historical content. Give this video a thumbs up if it has opened your eyes to something new about the Middle East or made you think differently about how nations are really created. And here is the thing. There are so many more stories like this one waiting to be told. The birth of Iraq from the ruins of Mesopotamia, the creation of Transjordan from desert tribes and British ambitions, the tragic partition of Palestine, the rise and fall of Arab nationalism. Each of these stories is as complex as human and as relevant as the story of Lebanon we've just explored together. So hit that subscribe button and join me as we continue exploring how the modern world really came to be. Because understanding history isn't just about satisfying curiosity, it's about becoming better, informed citizens of the world we live in today. And frankly, our world could use more people who understand how we got here and what it all means. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep remembering that behind every line on a map, there are real human stories waiting to be told. Cheers. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.